Rise of the Triad was certainly a unique shooter when it was released back in 1995. While the game wasn't as technically impressive as Doom 2, which came out the same year, due to ROTT being made on a modified Wolfenstein engine, it had enough personality to stand out. Rise of the Triad is not my favorite FPS game of this era, and I think the technical limitations and the repetitive level design hold it back, but it still has a cult following, mostly due to its wacky sense of humor. The game had goofy power-ups like the God and Dog modes, the enemies in the game were just digitized 3D Rome stuff, and it also features ridiculous weapons like the Escalabat. For all of its shortcomings, Rise of the Triad had so much charm to it, and I'd happily play an episode or two again in the future. Like I said before, the main criticism I have with the original game is that the levels kinda blend in with one another, and that's mostly because of ROTT being on the Wolfenstein engine. Wolfenstein 3D didn't have very distinct map layouts, and it gets a little tedious playing through the game because there are 60 fucking levels in total. Rise of the Triad luckily only has 4 episodes, with usually 8 levels each. That being said, the game still runs into the same issue as Wolfenstein, and gets really dull to finish by the end. Considering that the machine gun will be your workhorse weapon during the campaign, and you only get a handful of explosive weapons that you can only carry one at a time, the game kinda gets stale as you progress. Rise of the Triad is still a fun game, like I said in my original review, but to me, it isn't in the higher echelon of 90s first-person shooters. I'm aware of its cult audience, and I know that the game has a wacky, awesome personality, but it's not my personal favorite FPS game. With that in mind, recently I played the shareware version of Rise of the Triad, titled The Hunt Begins. Initially I thought the shareware copy of ROTT just contained the first episode of the full game, just like every other FPS shareware game at the time. However, this is not the case, and just like in Rise of the Triad tradition, the shareware version of the game is unique and wacky, as it contains an exclusive episode. Yeah, so there are 8 brand new levels that differ from the 8 levels in the first episode of the full game. I guess that's why the shareware copy is subtitled The Hunt Begins, while the full version of ROTT is called Dark War. It's a theory, but that makes the most sense to me. The most interesting aspect about the shareware version is that, in my opinion, it features better levels than in episode 1. To be honest, I can't really remember that many levels from the original game, and the only map I recall from the first episode is Spring Surprise. This level features a bunch of springs to jump on obviously, and the map itself has a very washed out look to it, which I find visually interesting. I mean, it just looks like the player has turned the brightness up all the way, but still it's the most unique level of episode 1. Now let's take a look at The Hunt Begins. E1M1 immediately has a cooler layout compared to the full game. The 4 pillars that have raising platforms attached to them and the rocket launcher you obtain at the start is great. The room with the moving fire blocks and the group of enemies that will most likely get killed by said blocks is also nicely designed and is fairly distinct. E1M1 is a fairly well designed opening level, and while I consider it a little more difficult than episode 1 of the full game, it's nothing too bad of course. They're still easing you into the episode. Foggy Mountain is the next level, and it switches up the aesthetic completely. The first level was dark and rather moody, and now E1M2 is bright and sunny. There's a section that reminds me a ton of the room where you pick up the blue key in Doom E1M4, Command Control. There's a trigger somewhere that opens these 4 doors which reveal a group of guards. Speaking of triggers, if you try and pick up the gold key in this level, a trap will be unveiled with a small crowd of guards waiting to ambush you. There's another set piece later on where these hallways will fill up with gas, and you'll have to find the gas mask to stay safe. I love the fact that the shareware episode is introducing all of these unique stage hazards and gimmicks this early into the set, even though you can still survive the gas without the mask if you're careful. I do prefer E1M2 to the last level, just because it has more going on in terms of set pieces and little traps.
Shoot him!
E1M3 is rather simple with its premise, since all you have to do is open up these 4 doors as the title alludes to. This level introduces the Shrooms mode power-up, and if you pick it up accidentally, you'll have a harder time killing the guards that are situated on top of these platforms, which make them even more difficult to hit. The Flying Mercury power-up also makes its debut, as well as the secret exit that you can take in this level.
Outsider! Yes.
For a secret level, E1M8 is kinda forgettable, but I still remember it being decent. Most of the levels in the Shareware episode have at least one set piece that sticks out, which is more than what I can say about a lot of the levels in the full game. I feel like The Hunt Begins gives players a good crash course into the game, and it does a pretty good job at making players want to buy it. There are over 30 levels in the full game, none of which are included in the Shareware release. Go get it now. It sounds like a great deal, and making a good impression is exactly what Shareware should do, enticing customers into buying the final product. E1M4 plays kinda like a Wolfenstein 3D map. There are low ceilings, the layout of the rooms are similar to Wolf 3D, and the only aspect that Rise of a Triad has over Wolfenstein is the level hazards, which do add to the map as a whole. Not counting the secret level, we have an outdoor level that's set at night, an outdoor level that's set in the day, an indoor level with large open spaces, and now an indoor level with tight, cramped rooms to maneuver through. The variety in the Shareware episode for ROTT standards is fantastic, and that continues with E1M5. Now this level introduces the robot enemies, who can only be destroyed with explosives. Even in the final few levels of the episode, it still manages to sprinkle in more variables, and I feel like the full game could have done this better. I think each episode introduces an enemy type and theme and then sticks to it 100%, which dampens the overall experience. Episode 3 goes way too far with the robot enemies, while episode 4 is full of those fucking monks. It seems like there's no variety in those 2 episodes specifically, and I know it's unfair comparing one Shareware episode to a full game, but my point about ROTT's level design still stands without even mentioning the Shareware version. E1M6 seems way more open than the previous levels, and one of your modes of transport is riding on these platforms here, which is easier said than done. This takes too fucking long, and while I appreciate the gimmick and everything, it's kind of a pain in the ass. The final level of the Shareware episode introduces the Triad Enforcers, and this is a cool endgame enemy to throw at the player. There's no real boss at the end of the level, so instead they just pack in a whole group of enforcers, which is fitting. Rise of a Triad The Hunt Begins is a solid set of levels, and if you don't like the original game due to its level design, maybe try this episode out. It's kind of ironic that Apogee used the Shareware version to promote the full game, but now over 25 years later I'm using the full game in a roundabout way to promote The Hunt Begins. Hopefully soon enough we'll get a chance to play both games in high quality when the remaster comes out. But for right now though, you should definitely download the Shareware episode of Rise of a Triad. Cue the Civiatro music.